And we are live. Hopefully people are already seeing us. I just need to change one thing over here first to make sure that everybody can see what we're doing. I didn't hear what you said.
How many people tend to watch this?
Somewhere generally between 50 and 100 on live, but then it
I saw
okay, we should be live. I'm not seeing it on my Facebook again, so I'm not sure what's going on. We should be already live.
300 people.
And we should be live both on Facebook and on YouTube. And for some reason, it's not coming up on my Facebook, so I can't change the privacy. Do you see it on my Facebook, Yolis?
I don't see it yet. No.
So it claims we're live, so people are probably listening to us. But I just had to change the privacy, otherwise it can't be shared.
Right. Why can't I get this off here?
Okay. Well.
All right. No, you're not on. It's not on yet.
Let me try something else, because we should also be on the live stream on the site. And for those that are going to the site, so I'm testing that now, and we don't seem to be on that either. Strange, because it says on this platform that we're live on both these platforms. So let's keep trying until we can see that actually happening. Okay, so I see it now on the YouTube and on our live stream.
It just takes a few minutes to kick in, I think.
Yeah, but until I have it on my Facebook, I can't change the privacy to share it. So maybe Yehudis, maybe you could start talking meanwhile, so we can want more
people. Welcome everybody
to
our Thursday night shiur with Rabbi Pinchas Winston from Telstone, Israel. Rabbi Winston joins us in the two different projects that are merging together, and many other projects, bringthemhome.org, an initiative to encourage people to make Aliyah, and the Miriam Project, Geula Hour, which is on SoundCloud, which is a Geula program, interviewing people, discussing the days that we're living in, which we believe we are living in the days of the Geula right now, and Rabbi Winston often speaks to this. I'll just introduce quickly. We say this every week, but for those of you who are new, Rabbi Pinchas Winston was born in Toronto, Canada. I know. He's very modest. He received rabbinic ordination in 1988. He worked very closely with Rabbi Noach Weinberg, was very intimately involved and in charge of the Esha Torah program in Toronto and then in Eretz Israel.
No, that's a mistake.
Okay, we'll correct that.
I worked there.
You worked there. Okay, fine. He has, we do a little known fact about Rabbi Winston. He was an architect in his early days before he became a rabbi. And now he's a prolific writer of everything Jewish, inspired by current events with a major focus on topics of Eretz Israel and end of days. He does a weekly Parsha series. He does many, many webinars and programs you can tap into on his website called 36.org. That's spelled out TIRTYSIX.org. We'll put that out there a few times. You can get his shiurim and all his programs on Kindle, MP3, on all kinds of formats and videos. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Rabbi Pinchas Winston. Thank you for joining us, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this is actually a continuation of last.
Again, Rabbi, before you begin, and I also want to mention, that last. I'm sorry. I just wanted to mention that last week you did mention that you were chief rabbi of the IDF for one day, and I did look that up, and BBC indeed reported that you were chief rabbi of the IDF for a day. Yeah. So that is absolutely 100% accurate fake news.
Exactly. And as a result of that, I got a fake pension. Okay. moving on.
And please remind everybody the topic of your for tonight. Please.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I began last week talking about what I call paradigm for power. Most people, who are familiar with the Chumash, obviously the Torah itself finished with the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. When he died, it closed. Then you have the book of the prophets, you have the writings, and the prophecy ended 3448. I think it was 353 BCE, a long time ago, over 2,000 years ago. And it's like that got pushed aside. And that was if you believe in it, and of course we do, it's our life, and we learn it all the time. But in a sense, we look at it as if that was one reality, one stage of history, and then it got closed and left behind, and then this came after. And of course, those who don't believe in Torah and don't believe in Tanakh at all, they feel that there's nothing valid there to look at. It was just written by a bunch of elderly people, archaic thinking going back that time. So there's no application in terms of everyday life, and of course, both opinions are wrong because the truth is, it's just the opposite. It's like, if you were to see it the way God sees it and the way the reality actually is, there's Tanakh, which is like the structure of all of history, because the prophets spoke about the end of days. They talked about all the way into our period of time and into the Messianic period of time, and Kabbalah addresses, of course, beyond that and goes into what to come, things like that. And everything else exists inside of it. So the very fact that the secular world, for example, doesn't take religion seriously and thinks that they're outside that box, they actually reside inside that box. And the reason why I'm making this point is because it's very important to understand and know that whatever's going on today it's not new. The clothing is different, the people are different, but the truth is that it's the same old man as always existed, in some respects less informed than in previous generations, and the same Yetzer Hara, the same inclinations that we had to do chet. The clothing may change, the generations change, the distractions change, but for all intents and purposes, the people are the same. And if you look into Shar HaGilgulim, for example, the Gate of Reincarnations by the Rizal, which talks about reincarnation, and there he actually shows you who reincarnates into whom. And this is an ongoing process. And we talk about Amalek, a biblical nation. We talk about Eisav and Ishmael, things like that. It's not just a namesake. These are realities that repeat themselves in every generation. So the bodies might be new. They're born brand new in each generation, but the souls have been reincarnating, coming back. So the main point is that if you want to understand the present, you have to understand the past. If you want to know where you're going in the future, you have to understand what took place back then and how it affects today and moving on. So last week we looked at Migdal Bavel, which seems to be almost like a fairy tale. Can't exactly imagine how that could have ever existed, ever worked, ever functioned, that people could be so silly if they actually tried to build something like that. And we broke it down and looked at the fact that it was something that was much more serious than it seems to be from the verses themselves, because we read them so simplistically. But if you look at the Midrashim and the Gemara, the Gadata, and even the Kabbalah behind that, you find out that what was going on back then is a thread that runs all the way through history until current day. And the people sitting in Congress or the House of Representatives or the House of Commons or wherever they sit in Parliament in different countries, they may not look at themselves as being repetitions or even the housing, so to speak, of past souls. But there's a good chance that if somebody's making waves, especially in a negative way, but also in a positive way too, if they're making, they're coming to the forefront and they're doing something and they're trying to direct history, there's a good chance that this is somebody whose soul probably comes from ancient times and they're acting out in modern day life. So the Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babylonia, the Tower of Babel, that's babbling for here. The Tower of Babel, that itself is a paradigm for all of history. New World Order comes from that idea over there, the idea of challenging God, the idea of trying to minimize the role of God in creation to the point of scientizing every miracle that might possibly exist and how the three different parts of the tower. That's what we looked at last week. So I left off with something which I basically call the three faces of Asaph. Asaph, of course, is Esau. He was the one born as a twin brother of Jacob, Yakov. And, from the Chumash, he just looks like a nasty fellow, somebody who doesn't quite get it right. In the beginning, the Medrash says he was pretty much like Yaakov. They're very much like twins. But by the time they got to bar mitzvah age, it was very clear that Eisav was a man of the field, meaning he went out there and he was doing his thing. And it wasn't always a pleasant thing. He was doing all the naughty stuff that you're not supposed to do in every day, in life with other people. And Yaakov, of course, went the path of the tzaddik, the path of Torah, and they diverged and went in different directions. And of course, the famous story is that Asaph comes home from hunting, actually from murdering and stealing and all kinds of stuff, and he's totally wiped out, and to the point of death, apparently. And he says to Yaakov, "What do you got cooking over there?" And of course, Yaakov is cooking the food for mourners because Abraham had just passed away, and Yitzchak was mourning. That's his father, so he had cooked the traditional meal for a mourner. And basically, Asaph said, "Give me that food, pour it down my throat. I need the food before I die." And they made the deal. And at that point in time, Yaakov bought the birthright from Asaph, and that kind of cut him out of being a leader in the Jewish people. Just like there were four mothers, right? Four imohot. There was Sarah, Rivka, Rucha, and Leah. There were supposed to be four avot, also four avos, four fathers, right? Four forefathers, right? It was Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Asaph. And David HaMelech later on came and replaced Asaph. He was red and ruddy with blood in his hands, but he was L'Shem Shemayim. He was all for God. So therefore, he was a kosher version of Asaph. But Asaph could have been, like Yaakov, one of the forefathers if he had followed that path, and he would have been like the leader. He would have been the president, the prime minister, and Yaakov would have been the Gadol Hador. They would have worked together to guide the Jewish people to the Messianic era. But he gave up on all that and sold the birthright to Yaakov. And then later on, of course, Yaakov had to dress up and take the blessings from Eisav because now that he was the firstborn, he also had the right to the blessings. So the whole thing transpires and runs away. And it's right there in the Chumash, you can look. But other than that, and some of the midrashim that detail Eisav and what his life was like and who he was, people don't have a good understanding what Eisav is historically, what he means to us historically. And if you look in the psukim, the verses, with Torah, you have to pay very close attention. There are nuances, and you can read right over them and miss them year after year after year. It always amazes me after 14, 15 years of seeing the same thing a specific way. All of a sudden, one day, you see it slightly different, and it's a whole insight in a whole vista of understanding that really changes everything to a large degree, or a lot of things, and your perspective on life. So we really see from the Chumash itself and from the Midrashim that there are three facets to Eisav. Three facets. The one that we're most familiar with is Eisav the brute, the one who basically imposes his will on anybody and everybody to get what he wants. And he's not nice about it. He's not into public relations. Doesn't care about that. Doesn't care what the world thinks. He wants something, he takes it, end of story. And that was his reputation. But we also see, interesting enough, in the Chumash, and Rashi points this out, that Eisav also can be kind of religious, not authentically religious, but there's some aspect of him that kind of like ties him to more spiritual matters, even though it's not really authentic in the end, as Rashi points out, the commentator on the Chumash, when he comes to his father and he says to his father, how to take tithes on straw. Maybe he's playing games or shenanigans, but nevertheless, the fact that he was even focused on that particular idea shows there's some connection on some level, not enough, but something. And that makes a difference because we'll see how that plays out in history later on as well. And then you have the last Eisav, which is the one that's really in the Medrash, and most people probably aren't aware of it, but Eisav was a lawyer. He was actually a lawyer, one of the, earlier lawyers, and he was famous for getting his clients off the hook no matter what they had done wrong. He talked well, and he had convincing arguments, and he was a businessman. He was somebody who made deals. He understood how to do that. He understood how the world worked. So it's hard to understand how you can have these three different facets in one person, but he was three-faced. And in biblical times, people were a little bit different than they are today. They had much more capacity for both good and for evil. And these are the three faces of Eisav that were confronted by in the Chumash, that we see in the Chumash, but also play themselves on history, because the Jewish people, of course, are the Jewish people today. The same Jewish people they were back then, they are today, just different generations. And of course, Yishmael is the basis of the Arab world. Other than people converted later on from Asaph to him, but the Arabs come from Ishmael. And that's been the same way going all the way back to Abraham and Yitzchak's time. What about Asaph? Where did he go? Who's he, right? Because obviously everyone today is, by definition, a descendant of one of these people. So who are the descendants of Asaph? So just take a look around. A vast majority of the population today comes from Asaph. And you can see the world divides basically into three different categories. At least his population, Europe population, Russia, America, they all come from Asaph. You have to understand that America at the beginning wanted to be the Third Reich. Being the Third Reich was a big deal for Europeans. It has a very bad name today because of the Germans. They saw themselves as a continuation of Rome, but everybody wanted to be the continuation of Rome. The Senate is called the Senate because it came from Roman ideology and Roman columns, and they wanted to call the Potomac River the Tiber River, and they wanted to call Washington Rome, and they broke away and didn't do these things in the end, but there was a very strong connection because Rome was a model of development and progress. Not everything about Rome is positive, but it certainly was the basis of a lot of Western thinking today. It's a continuation. And this is why, even though Rome is not a power in the world like it was back in the beginning, the fourth and final exile of the Jewish people is called Galus Edom, which is the Galus of Asaph and Edom. And even though Edom is like almost a forgotten term, everything today basically in this exile that's helping to shape the Jewish people and prepare them for the final redemption is Asaph-like. It's all based, on Asaph. Ishmael is in the picture for sure, but it's a little bit different in terms of his role that he plays. And the question is where. So if you take a look around, I mean, it's pretty obvious that Russia. I mean, I always found that a ironic thing that the English name for that country would actually translate in Hebrew. Asaph was called Asaph HaRussia, not Russian, but Asaph HaRussia. He was called a Russian, and Russia, is there a connection? I can't say for sure, but it is interesting, especially considering that their color is red. They choose red to represent that nation. So you've got this, Edom is red, and that, it's these red things. That's the color associated with Asaph and Din, for that matter. Judgment, it's an idea of tzimtzum and constriction of God's light. So that's Asaph. And on top of that, Russia is certainly a country that has imposed its will anywhere and everywhere it possibly can. And it's not concerned about public relations. It's not concerned about how this is what we need, this is what we want, this is what we take, right? And the rest of the world can take a hike if they want to. If it's necessary for the sake, I just read something last week. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's false news or not. Just one of these news bubameister, so to speak. But Russia was reported saying that anyone who attacks them will get nuked. That's it. What attack us? We're going to nuke you, right? Can we just talk first? Whether that's true or not, but that is the attitude that they've had for the longest time. And where does that come from? That comes from that aspect of Asaph. And the Jewish people had to undergo that for whatever reason as part of their process. Now, the truth is that they weren't the only ones. Of course, Nazi Germany was very much this way. That Amalek, Eisav, they're all related. And the Holocaust, Shoah, was certainly, and likewise the same thing as well. The Germans were not concerned about what the world thought about them. They had a plan, they had a desire, they knew what they wanted, and they took it. That's the first aspect. So what about Asaph, the religious guy, the guy who can connect? Again, it's a very interesting thing also that in Rome, the Vatican, red is a very popular color for whatever reason. There's all kinds of Gemaras and Midrashim about what happened back in early Rome in terms of their understanding of the struggle between Asaph and Yakov. But you see that Catholicism specifically and Christianity in general wasn't just about accepting their version of the Messiah that they were killing us for, but we were the threat. We've always been the threat. Yaakov is the twin brother of Asaph, and he's always a threat to the other. As one stands, the other can't stand as well. One has to go. They both can't coexist at the same time. So that was Europe for the longest time, and the Jewish people had to undergo that as well. That produced a whole religion that covered a good part of the world and certainly imposed its will upon the Jewish people in religious terms. The Crusades, pogroms that were done in the name of God. That's the second aspect. And the Jewish people went through that over the Middle Ages, going back to Roman times, and pretty much up until World War II. But both aspects, for the most part, seem to have stopped around World War II. With the end of the Holocaust, the end of the Shoah, the World War II, that part of Asaph seems to have disappeared. Thank God, shouldn't have to come back again. And likewise, you have Russia. They allowed the Jews. The USSR collapsed in 1989, and as a result of that, the Jewish people were allowed to emigrate for the first time in the 70s, 80 some odd years freely, and they go back and forth still. There's still Jews living there, but they can have more normal lives for the time being. And the only one left was Asaph, the businessman. And where did he go? Where is he? So you can see that's pretty much the rest of the Western world, the non-religious aspect of it, and specifically America. And why do I say specifically America? Because Canada's like this, and England is like this as well, and all kinds of countries in the Western world, France, Spain, wherever Jews might be. It's very much the same idea. The only thing is that America is where the other half of the Jews are located. And that's the point. It'll affect others as well on the side, and it's all part of the overall picture. But the fact that you have 5.5 million to 6 million Jews, I don't know the exact count at this point in time, living in America, and the other half, for the most part, living in Israel, means these are the two stages of the Jewish people at the end of history, and we have to undergo that third stage. That was the last one. So the Holocaust pushed us out of Europe, sent us to the four corners of the world, but primarily the population in America, the Jewish population, that's when it increased the most over the last 50, 60, 70 some odd years, as more and more refugees and families began to grow, develop there, and be born there. And now we went from being a very small community. There were Jews going back to the time of the American colonies, but there was a very small community at that time, and it grew. And only around the end of the 1800s, I believe, that you start to get an influx of Jews from Europe because anti-Semitism was growing, and then of course what was going on in Germany. But a lot of the population grew since World War II, post World War II, and that seems to be the last stage, the last aspect of Asaph that we have to confront. That's our now, and then when that's over, then we'll have done everything. Because what is the goal? What is the goal of the Jewish people? So the goal of the Jewish people basically is right in Parshas V'Yishlach, in really two places. It seems like a side story, but it's not. It's really very important, because what happens is that Yakov is coming back from Lavan's house. God tells him Lavan is finished. Yakov got all that he needed, all he required to absorb from Lavan. He took it, and mostly in Rachel and Leah, and then they had the Shvat and the tribes, and also in terms of the wealth he took with him on the way out. This all carries sparks of holiness that Yaakov had to redeem from the side of impurity to the side of holiness, and now he's on his way home. And he knows he has to confront Asaph. Now, what's really interesting is that it seems like it's inevitable. He has to confront Asaph. How else are you going to get home? Asaph's there, you're over here, you're over here. Yeah, you're around him. It's like, and if you go around him, it looks like you're afraid and doesn't look so good. So it seems like the confrontation is inevitable. The truth is, there's a Medrash says it wasn't. In fact, Yaakov is blamed. He's criticized for this. If Yaakov wanted to, he could have gone south around the Dead Sea, further south, back to Beersheba, where his father was living, and avoided every confrontation with Eisav, at least for the time being. If Eisav came looking for him, what can you do? But he wasn't. Eisav was satisfied. Whatever grudge he harbored going back to the time of the brachos, basically he gave up on. Why? Because now he had his own group of people who were like him. He was a successful individual. He had pretty much all that he wanted, although he always wanted more, but he was at least comfortable, that's for sure. And a lot of water had passed under the bridge. It was already 34 years later, at least 34, if not 35 years later. It's a long time till to hold a grudge at that point in time. So Yaakov literally and could have avoided Asaph if he wanted to, and the Medrash says it was like walking up to a rabid dog and pulling on his ear or his tail or something. If he's not paying attention to you, avoid him. Run away from him. Leave him. Wait to aggravate this dog and anger and antagonize and sick this dog on yourself. Why bother? And that's what Yaakov is like. He went over and he yanked Eisav by sending in these gifts and purposely going back by him through his path to confront him. And the Medrash seems to be critical of Yaakov for this reason. Why? Why do it? Why go out of your way to endanger yourself? You just survived love and Baruch Hashem miraculously. Why make it more difficult for yourself by going to confront somebody who might be a potential enemy? And you're going to remind them. You can see, remember the whole thing, and then maybe his anger will be reawakened. So the only problem with that is that because he does this, he has the fight with Eisav, or at least the Sarshal Eisav, the angel of Eisav, the Sitra Achra, right? The angel that's responsible for overlooking Eisav and giving him what he needs and supporting him. That's who Yaakov fights with the entire night. He goes back for some valuable things, actually not so valuable things, but they were valuable spiritually. And he meets this stranger who we're told later on. It's a very weird confrontation, so it can't just be anybody. It wasn't just a highway robber or something like that. It's somebody who was unique, and he fights the entire night. And then, of course, the whole thing with the angel, what's your name? And he gives him a whole different name. In the end, he calls him Yisrael. That's significant to be called Yisrael, the namesake of the Jewish people forever. The level that we're all supposed to reach. Yaakov made a mistake to go back and confront Eisav, confronts his angel the night before, and he gets called the right thing. That's a benefit. There must be something more to it than simply that, he made a mistake. And then, of course, God confirms this whole thing after the episode in Shechem, where Dinah is violated, and Yaakov stays quiet, and he gets praised for this. And then God says, yes, your name is now Yisrael from that point onward. So, the question is, what's the story behind the story? So, as I mentioned before, there were supposed to be four forefathers. When Yaakov bought the birthright from Eisav and then took the blessings, in effect, he became Eisav. He absorbed whatever holiness and relevance Eisav had with respect to the Jewish people and being part of their connection to God, their nation, in terms of being a Torah nation, whatever connection he had, that was absorbed by Yaakov. So he thought. So when he went to marry his future wife, it should have only been Rachel, because and it's a little bit of a long story going back to Adam HaRishon in the Garden of Eden, but that's for another time, perhaps, B'ezras Hashem. But he was fixing it up. And what happened was that when he became Yaakov and Eisav combined in one being, so then what happened was that it should have happened to Rachel and Leah too. Because it turned just like Rachel was for the younger one, the younger for the younger, the older for the elder, because there was some spiritual match, going on over here. So it should have been that when Yaakov absorbed all of Eisav into him, that Rachel automatically absorbed all of Leah into her, and therefore there should have been one marriage of Yaakov to Rachel. What happens? We know the story. The Chumash tells you, right? They even worked it out, as the Gemara points out, that Yaakov and Rachel were clearly aware of what Lavan was going to try and do. So they devised a very simple scheme. Yaakov gave Rachel a password so he could know who it was, because in those days we didn't have like floodlights and projector lights and all that. It was candles and torches and things like that. It was very easy not to see clearly, and not just sure about the voices, but somehow it worked out that way. And he gave Rachel the password, but says the Gemara that Rachel had Rachmanas on her sister and then ruined the whole thing. So she actually went ahead and gave the password to Leah. So that way, when they went into the tent, and Yaakov said, "Who is it? Who's there?" She gave the password. So Yaakov, okay, so it's Rachel, and everything transpired as it did. The next one he wakes up and realizes that it was not Rachel, it was Leah, and he was married to her. Two questions. Number one is that halachically we call it a mekach ta'ut, a mistaken purchase, meaning that if you get married to somebody you did not intend to get married to, it is null and void. You don't even require divorce. Just it never happened. You have to have the proper intention to get married to a specific purpose. We don't see anywhere that Yaakov remarried Leah. He seems to have accepted the fact that she is his wife, and we see from her come 6 of the Shvatim. Something very good going on over there. She was obviously meant to be there. And the dialogue goes like this. Yaakov says, what are you doing here? And how could you possibly do a thing like this, deceive me the way you have? And she says, well, first of all, you're asking me that question? Weren't you the one who dressed up as your brother and went before your father? There's a mitzvah of kibbud av ve'em. And for those people who say that the Avos, didn't keep the mitzvahs in Chutz La'aretz, they did keep the mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael. That's where they were living. So the mitzvah, honor your father and mother, would be very important. And you see, Yaakov doesn't want to do it. He's afraid to do that. But he's forced to because of the circumstances. And his mother tells him, it's what you have to do. And she says, you dressed up and deceived your own father, so don't talk to me about deception. And he says, yeah, but that was all the Shem Shemaim. My mother told me I do it for the sake of the Jewish people. And Leah said, well, I'm also doing it for the sake of the Jewish people, the future Jewish people. And he says, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? I'm supposed to marry your sister. That was the agreement. I don't care what your father was thinking. So Leah says to Yaakov, didn't you buy the birthright? Yes, for sure. Did you not take the blessings from Eisav? 100%. So she said, well, when you did that, you became Asaph too. Yaakov as well, but Asaph as well. And everyone knows that Rochel is for Yaakov and Leah is for Asaph. And when you took Asaph into you took the right to marry me as well. So therefore, by divine providence, you have to accept me, because that's part of the fulfillment of the prophecy of the building of the Jewish people. And Yaakov acquiesced. He heard it, but he was disturbed. Why? Because he had thought that he had taken everything that was holy about Eisav into him and left Eisav basically an empty shell, just to be whatever he's going to be and go through life spiritually empty, as he does for the most part. So when he found out that Leah still was a separate individual, that meant that Asaph also still was a separate individual. And that's why Yaakov goes out of his way to confront Asaph. There's something left. Yaakov understands that. There's something left over that has to be extracted from Asaph to make him fully the hybrid of Yaakov and Asaph that a Yisroel is. So even though the Medrash says he was faulted for doing this, you look at the language exactly. In fact, very relevant to this week's Parsha. Parsha Shlachacha Adashim, the Torah tells you, send spies. As Rashi points out, God's telling Moshe and the Jewish people, I'm not sending the spies. You send the spies, not me. So I don't get it. Is it a mitzvah? Is it an avera? What is it? If it's an avera, why is Moshe doing it? If it's a mitzvah, why is God not commanding it? Because we have a rule. There's a rule. In general, it's a solid rule that has only a few exceptions, but for the most part, the rule is that God will never command you to do a mitzvah that's risky for your life. He won't put you in a situation like that. If Chas v'Chalila is a time of shmad, of destruction, when a person has to die, all Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name, that's one of the few mitzvahs where that is the mitzvah itself. But other than that, in everyday life, the mitzvah is not to endanger yourself. So, for example, since childbirth is in fact a dangerous thing, and was once more dangerous than it is today, but still dangerous. People still die in childbirth, God forbid. So therefore, there's no mitzvah on a woman to have children. The husband has the mitzvah. She can comply, but it's a mesirus nefesh on her part. She has no direct mitzvah because there's a danger involved in giving birth to children. So likewise, Hashem says to the Jewish people in this week's Parsha, there's a danger involved. You're not quite ready for this task. It's a big risk, and I'm not going to send you. You go on your own. It's your own risk. And this is a concept that runs going back even to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This idea of taking this risk, in a situation like that. So Yaakov was not commanded or told by God to go back and confront Asaph, but he took the risk himself because he wanted to finish the job, to become this completion. And he succeeds. He succeeds. 100%. In fact, right after he fights with the angel and he recovers, and there's all kinds of Hanukkah connections in that story, it says he arrives in Shechem Shalem. He gets to Shechem Shalem, complete. And even though the Torah will call him Yaakov a few times after that, but for the most part, he certainly dies as Yisrael, as the Pri Tzaddik points out, which is why many say when the Gemara says that Yaakov didn't die, it's literal. It means he didn't die. He didn't have to die. He went to a whole different level called Yisrael, and that allowed him to go to the next world and transition without having to go through death itself. That's what the Medrash basically says regarding Yaakov Avinu. So the only question in all of this is that, okay, so what about the rest of the Jewish people? Yaakov did this, but 11 of the Shvatim had already been born by the time that Yaakov had this confrontation. So the answer is that Yaakov himself personally was able to achieve this very high level, but the Shvatim, they didn't, not yet. And it turns out that the rest of Jewish history is the struggle of the Jewish people to go from being only a Yaakov to a Yisrael. And that's why it's an interesting thing. It's even more than interesting. It's a curious thing how you have the situation. And again, it's a very sensitive topic. And I'm just going to mention a few points over here without going to the whole discussion. Anybody who has questions about this, you can get in touch with me. I have a book about this, explains it in more detail. But it was very ironic from this point of view that when in 2000, right, that was supposed to be the year of Y2K. And Y2K in Hebrew is Yud Beis Kuf. And Yud Beis Kuf is the word Yabok. And that's the river that Yaakov crossed over to become Yisrael. A northern tributary. You can look at the map. It still, still tells you the name is still there. It's the northern tributary that he crossed over on the way back, and there's Israel, where he confronted Eisav, at least the Sar Shalefes, and then Eisav, and becomes a Yisrael. So from the Torah itself, the word Yabok doesn't seem significant, other than the fact that's where it took place, although that itself should make it significant. But from Kabbalah, we know it's very significant. In Shar HaGilgulim, the Arizal explains that Yabok is also a gematria of three of Hashem's names that correspond to the three levels of soul, Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama. And if a person goes the distance to develop and to rectify all three levels of soul, they become what's called an Adam Shalem. Yaakov went to Shechem Shalem, an Adam Shalem. And he has access to these three levels of God's name. And when they come together, it's called Yabok. So Yabok also, Kabbalistically, symbolizes the spiritual transition every Jew goes from being a Yaakov to a Yisrael. And Maisa Avos, Simon Labani, as the Ramban points out, whatever happened to the forefathers is there to teach us what we're supposed to do the rest of history. So the rest of history really has been about crossing the Yabok. That's all it's been about. All the exiles we've gone through, going back to Galus Bavel and onward, and certainly Mitzrayim too. That was all about that. To go from being a Yaakov to a Yisrael. Because a Yaakov is a twin brother of Eisav and can act like Eisav. Just take a look around. I mean, you have J Street, for example, right? Which is Jews acting like Eisav instead, even against the Jewish people. We can shop until we drop, just like Eisav does. Hollywood began with Jews, and there's Jews all through it. You name it. We can be just like Eisav, and in some respects, as the Gemara points out, even more Eisav than Eisav himself. Yisrael rises above that. He rises above it. So he's a hybrid. He extracts the good from Eisav, combines it with Yaakov, and becomes something called Yisrael. And that's the struggle of history. So that's why it's a very interesting thing. Maybe not, maybe yes. That if you take Y2K, which was the year 2000, which was significant for a number of reasons, that it's, Y2K spells Yabok. And then what happens immediately after that? The Twin Towers. Twins, right? The Twin Towers are destroyed in an incredible way that really, technically speaking, should never have happened, and changes the world and changes history. Is clearly a historic turning point and specifically for the Jewish people, that signals pretty much the final stages of Galus Edom. There's a lot more to say about this. We can go into it basically, but the whole concept of being Israel, and that the last stage of our exile should be in America primarily, and the Western world, because by extension, the Western world is America too. It's very much, I mean, you can't tell it to the Canadians for sure. They won't want to hear that. But if you look at the lifestyle, they're very similar, and so much overlap that you can go back and forth without much transition and changing, because the lifestyles are very similar. And that's the final stage. So the three phases of Eisav we've had to confront, and the power struggles are all the same. And these are the Yetzer Hara is driving. You read the newspapers and see what's going on today, and it just looks like a modern day event, whether it's chaotic, whether it's peaceful. But the reality is, as these are threads going back all the way to biblical times, and the Jewish people are undergoing these things specifically to finish off their transition from being a Yakov to Israel. And that's the selling place. That's the actual question that we're being asked right now. In fact, the Malbim says in his commentary to Yirmiyahu, incredible thing that in his time probably didn't even make sense, but in our time makes perfect sense. And he says there'll come a time. This is in chapter Lamed Aleph 31, I think the verses 15 to 16. You read the Malbim, he says it spells it out, because the verses there are talking about the end of days. And they happen to use the name Yaakov and Yisrael, these two names. And they're interchangeable in the verse. But the Malbim says there's a reason for the change. And he says, based upon the verses, based upon a tradition that he has, because he can't just make these things up, there'll come a time, and he's living in the 1800s, when anti-Semitism is still very strong. He says there'll come a time when the shibud will end, when the last place that Jews are being held en masse, and oppressed, it'll come to an end. And at that time, something interesting is going to happen. The Jewish people, after being murdered and stepped on and killed and insulted, the whole thing will finally be respected and allowed to become heads of the nations. They'll be allowed to become presidents and vice presidents of banks and companies, and to compete and live next door and have the same cars, the same clothing, the same lifestyle. He says that's going to happen. At that point in time, the Jewish people will divide into two parts. One part is going to be called Yaakov, and the verse refers to them, and one part is going to be called Yisrael. He says Yaakov is the name of the Jewish people in exile. So therefore, it refers to the majority of the Jews at that time, who will be called Yaakov because they live in the diaspora. And he says there'll be a small contingent called Yisrael, who will say, this is nice. Now, it's something we can work with, but it's not the end of the whole story. Until we go back to Eretz Yisrael and we rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, or get it to come back down from Shemayim, and the Shechina goes into that, it's not called Geula, it's not called redemption, and they're going to fight for that redemption, for that to happen. And the Malbim says, in their merit, based upon the verse, in their merit, the final redemption is going to come. So the whole struggle of the last couple thousands of years, 2,000 years, from the time that Pompey captured Jerusalem in 63 BCE, I believe, or 67, until Kristallnacht was literally 2,000 years. And that was the beginning of the Holocaust, acknowledged, after the war, and certainly the end of European Jewry as well. Not so much that, but Jewry, right? And the next stage of history, the last part of the confrontation. So we dealt already with Asaph the brutes, and we dealt with Asaph the religious guy, so to speak. And now we had to confront Asaph the businessman, not just to confront it, but to absorb and extract from that aspect of Asaph what we require for the sake of becoming a holy and complete nation that can go back to Israel at some point in time and build the nation the way it's supposed to be built, have the Beis Hamikdash come back, and the Shechina to come back into the Beis Hamikdash. So all of this is all of that. Whatever you're watching today, the power struggles in Congress between the Democrats and the Republicans, and the mudslinging and the false news and the riots and the looting, and just like it looks like just Hefker. as if there's no connection from one to the next, just people losing themselves, and the coronavirus, all part of that. It just seems like random events that just happen to happen because that's the way the world is. That's not true at all. It's part of an unfolding of events at the end of the day, specifically to help the Jewish people to go the final stages, the final steps to complete themselves, finally extract out of Eisav everything there is to extract, and then go back home and live as a Torah nation. So that's the three phases of Eisav. There's one more component that's left to address that's very much a part of what's going today. It's not just the backdrop. And so, in fact, in many respects, it's a small component, but very powerful component that really controls a lot of what's happening from behind the scenes. And of course, that's the Erev Rav. The Erev Rav doesn't need much of an introduction. All you have to do is open Parsha Kisisa, and you see the mixed multitude with the golden calf, and how they try to convince the Jewish people to go back to Egypt, and how they try to convince the Jewish people that God's not really their God, but false gods, whatever they might be in any generation. That's what we have to follow and pursue to break that connection between the Jewish people and God. Dangerous. Where'd they come from? So it's a long story, and some people say they were not converts. Other people say they were converts, but the Zohar seems to say that they were converts. The Rizal says they were converts, and they began as Egyptians who actually related more to the descendants of Yakov Avinu than to Egyptians. They honestly and sincerely gravitated back in Egypt towards what was the Jewish people at that time, and lived just outside because they connected more to them, which is why Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to take them out. It's also a long Kabbalistic story. Everything's a long Kabbalistic story. Going back to Adam and Rishon and the souls, how they reincarnate. It's all, again, there's material to read that will fill you in. But for the most part, they were converts, and God told Moshe, leave them behind because they're not developed enough. And Moshe knew that these souls had to undergo their own rectification, and that was part of the tikkun process for history. And he got a little impatient. He wanted to expedite it. So God said, it's your own risk. I'm telling you, it's not a good idea. And Moshe said, well, let's take them to Mount Sinai. They'll experience Har Sinai, and they're giving a Torah, and that's gotta win them over completely. And when that happens, they'll be full-fledged Jews, and they were for the time being until the golden calf. That changed everything. And from that point, basically, literally, they are the biggest thorn in the side of the Jewish people. And the Vilna Gaon, the Zohar, talks about this and warns the Jewish people, isolating 5 different categories of mixed multitude. And when you read the description, it's a little frightening sometimes because you get, well, I got that trait. I've got that trait. I'm a little like that, It's like, okay, so, you see it, back away, move, change that. The Zohar speaks about this. And the Gra came along and explained even more. And he says that really the final battle for the Jewish people is against the Erev Rav. The Erev Rav lives specifically to unite the koiches, the forces of the energy of Yishmael and Eisav, which today would be the Arab world and the Western world, against the Jewish people to destroy them. That's what they do. And how do they do that? Very interesting. Achizas Anayim. Achizas Anayim. Literally the grabbing of the eyes. Kind of like a magic trick. That's how the Arab, they make it look like they're your friend. They make it look like they're working on your behalf. They make it seem as if they have your best interest at heart, when in fact just the opposite is true. They're conniving and conspiring to destroy the Jewish people. And they primarily work from within the Jewish people. So there's a sefer I have that's based upon the teachings of the Vilna Gaon and the Ramchal, and he has one specific chapter where he talks about the Erev Rav, and he has a certain caveat at the beginning of that chapter that says, listen, before you go ahead and you start calling everybody Erev Rav who doesn't seem to conform to traditional Judaism, right? You should know it's not so simple. It's not so true. There's a big difference between people who don't know, they weren't taught, they have misunderstandings of what Torah is and Judaism, and people who go to war against it, who go to war against Jewish principles and Jewish ideas and the Jewish people, literally go to war. some people out of sight of mind. If you don't impose your values on me, fine. I don't agree with what you're doing. I think that's archaic, but you want to live like that? So do it over there. Fine. Okay? It's a horror. People don't understand the truth. Ask any Baal Tshuva how he once felt. Rabbi Akiva is quoted as saying that before he became a Baal Tshuva, if a Talmud Chacham had walked by him, he would have bitten his leg like a donkey and crushed the bone. Very strong bite. That's the way we see things before we are educated. And unfortunately, we don't do the best job of representing Torah Judaism to the outside world or care about it as we should. So that's one category. But when somebody actually goes to war against the Jewish people by weakening them, trying to undermine what they do, who they are, whether it's about giving land away to the enemy, to people who don't deserve it, to people who it doesn't belong to, quite frankly, or it's about trying to reduce the connection to Torah in any way by making it more difficult for people to learn Torah and to perform their mitzvahs. If they're going out of their way to do a thing like that, whether they're working through the legal system, around the legal system, behind the legal system, it doesn't make a difference. The Torah is the legal system. God's word is the legal system. Everything else is just an aberration, no matter how powerful it may seem to be today. When someone goes to war against Jewish values, against the Jewish people, by definition, they fall into the category of Erev Rav. Now, there are 5 different levels of Erev Rav, and some of them are more mild and can be brought back. They can be rectified. They can be taught the truth. They might even convert. There are stories in the Gemara, even of non-Jews, for example, Nebuzaradan, who was the general of Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the first temple. I mean, God's temple, the one that had the Shekhinah at one point inside of it. Terrible thing. And then he murders countless Jews after. And then realizes after all of that, because of an episode, that God's real, the Torah is true, and the Jewish people are his people, and for whatever reason, they're being made to suffer right now. Nonetheless, it is the truth. He goes ahead and he converts and becomes one of the Jewish people. And there's a few stories like that. It's possible to bring almost anyone back to Torah and Judaism with the proper help, the proper patience, the proper understanding. Some categories, unfortunately, according to the Vilna Gaon, and the Leshem also brings us down, that they're just too extreme. There's just no way. The truth will stare them in the face, and they will not be able to admit to it. They will not be able to make that change. And unfortunately, history will take care of them. I mean, fortunately, in the end, because that's what has to happen. Hashem will deal with it. But, and this is the clincher, the Vilna Gaon says very specifically, this is the final battle of the Jewish people. And he says it's going to be the worst of all. The Holocaust, you have to understand, there's no way to describe and understand the suffering of the Holocaust, no way to justify, rationalize, it's almost untouchable. But every single Jew, even the secular Jews in the Holocaust, who died as a Jew because they're Jewish, died al Kiddush Hashem and go right to Shemayim. 6 million martyrs. Even the ones who screamed, I don't want to die. Take me out of here. But they had no choice because they were Jewish and they were taken and put in the camps and they suffered like everybody else. And in the end, they maybe died like everybody else. Die al Kiddush Hashem. But somebody who lives out their life at the age of 90, almost no suffering, thinking that they're right by not living by Torah, thinking that they're right that God doesn't exist, and they live that way, they cut themselves off. God takes into account where we come from, what we go through. But certainly if somebody is going to use their abilities and their energies and their koiches to actually go to war against Judaism, that's very dangerous. No, they've never taken the time to prove or disprove God, which you can't disprove God. It's not possible. They've never taken the time to get to know Torah, just out of doubt, just out of the possibility you might be wrong. You don't want to live by it? Fine, go someplace else. But to go to war against it, another mind, that's a certain biblical koyach that's tied back to the Erev Rav. And the Gemara says that's the war we're fighting against people like that at the end of days. And it's the most serious war because it's the most, delusion like this. It's very hard to see the truth. This deception is unbelievable. The sheker, the lying, it's just unbelievable. And he says, but anybody who doesn't fight it, there's no neutral ground here, he says. Anybody who doesn't fight it, it's as if they joined the other side. And better off, they were never born. You don't find the Vilna Gaon using words like that lightly or very often at all. In fact, I think it's the only place I've ever seen it where he says a thing like that. It's deceiving because for the most part, you look at the world around you, we have financial issues. Now we have health issues. We have political issues. But we don't see ourselves so much in the biblical context and that we're fighting biblical wars. But we are. And when Hashem finally comes down, and he will, sooner than later, and shock the world by saying, yep, I'm here. And I've been here the whole time watching the whole thing. And you thought that all that the Torah spoke about was thousands of years in the past and no longer relevant? Well, let me show you something. It's been running the world the entire time. And you just didn't see that. But for the person who understands, this is the koyach, this is the thread of history, the faces of Eisav, Yishmael, Amalek, the Erev Rav, Gog and Magog. It's all the Bible coming back at the end of days, the reality. Understand that? So then that person's prepared, and they won't be surprised what happens next. We should be blessed to have such intellectual and spiritual clarity, to be able to see through the events of today and not be deceived by the falsehood that's rampant everywhere at all times, to be able to know what we have to do to rectify ourselves, rectify the world, to usher in the Messianic era we've been living for thousands of years, and we're so close at this point in time, without any further deception, suffering, and certainly not death. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them at this time.
Josh.
Yes, I don't see any questions, but everyone is welcome. We're streaming live on Facebook and on YouTube. You can put it in comments over there if you have any questions, and you're welcome to ask the rabbi a question. Unfortunately, on the direct link through our website, you cannot comment, you cannot ask questions, so it's only through the Facebook or YouTube live stream. Yudis,
Rabbi, I just want to ask, Rabbi, could you just elaborate a little bit more? I'm actually familiar with a lot of your concepts, but for people that don't know the difference between what is a Yakov kind of Jew and what is it, an Israel kind of Jew, could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, okay. I think it's good to point out, basically, but you see, the Torah actually identifies in the beginning. Yaakov, the Chumash in the beginning, Yaakov he's the one sitting in the tent studying Torah full time, cut off from the world. He's not part of the world, and that there's a place for that. Certainly in a person's life, there is, and certainly amongst the Jewish people, the idea of learning Torah full time. We have what people, as the Gemara refers to, Torah soul, people for whom Torah is their life, it's their whole world, and they certainly are the torchbearers for the generation. But Hashem takes Yaakov out of his tent. He literally rips him from the tents of Torah study and throws him into the world and exposes him to deception, and then he's got to go and he's got to deal with people like Eisav and situations like taking the blessings, and he has to go to Lavan, and he himself has to become a deceiver for the right reasons. And Hashem is constantly building and exposing. When he finally comes back, he leaves as a Yaakov, but he comes back as a Yisrael. So what has he done? And this maybe perhaps is a topic for next time because it's a little bit more complicated. But in the beginning, because it all goes back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, everything was very straightforward and simple. So how did he sin? Okay, that's a discussion we're going to have later, B'ezras Hashem. But it was very simple because the whole world was kadosh. The whole world was holy back at the beginning. And to actually rectify the world at that stage, because God had done most of the rectification himself, all Adam had to do was sit on his hands for 3 hours, so to speak, go into Shabbos not having eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that would have been the rectification for all of creation. He didn't do that. Instead, he ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And of course, he was expelled, and mankind has been living outside the garden for the last 5,780 years. And everything we do is just trying to get back there. That's the be all and end all of living in this world. And instead, we have to go all over the world. Look at the Jewish people going to exile. We get pushed around from one place to another place. What are we doing? What are we doing there? Every time we go to a different exile, every place in the world. But I'll tell you, to simplify things, in the time of Shlomo HaMelech, and he built the temple, King Solomon, everybody brought gifts to him. Why? Because all those gifts contained holy sparks. These sparks go back to creation. And in the Garden of Eden, they were like growing on trees. Everything was holy. When Adam ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he caused a combination of good and evil to spread to the entire world. So now those sparks of divine light got mixed together with spiritual impurity all over the world. So in King Solomon's time, when everything was the way it was supposed to be, he was the wisest man and the temple existed, the Jewish people were doing things properly. So people brought things to us which had in them the sparks. An apple has sparks. We have sparks. Our solar sparks. Clothing has sparks. Everything is sparks. The whole thing is made up from sparks. But the moment you use those sparks in a meaningful way, you free them and you rectify creation and bring it closer to perfection. That's what mankind's supposed to be doing, and specifically the Jewish people. So that's what we've been doing. Every time we go to a different place, it's to extract sparks from that particular place and bring them back to the side of holiness. That's what a Yisrael does. A Yaakov, he can do it also just by learning Torah too. If you learn it properly, that's what Yaakov is doing in the beginning. But we have been sent out by God to go looking for these sparks all over the world. When we settle in some place and we start building homes, we're using up sparks. You do it for mitzvahs, using up sparks the right way. You do it for the wrong reasons, you defile the sparks and slow down the redemption process. You make money, the money has sparks in it. Use the money to buy food for Shabbos. You just freed sparks for holy purposes. Every time we do a thing like that, we eat food, we digest it, the sparks are freed. You make a bracha, more sparks. You bench after, more sparks. That's what a Yisrael. Yisrael is somebody who's committed to the rectification of creation as a partner with God, who does it by using this world in a meaningful way that causes the sparks to be freed and sent back to heaven. You can look at creation as an upside-down hourglass. In general, an hourglass, all the sand's in the upper chamber, and it's got to flow to the lower chamber. And when it goes to the bottom chamber, time's up. If it's an hour worth of sand, an hour is passed. Instead, creation history historically is an upside-down hourglass with sparks in the bottom chamber that have to go to the upper chamber. And every time we do a mitzvah, every time we act the proper way, we cause sparks to go up. And all the sparks are gone from the lower chamber. Creation has reached the Messianic era.
Okay, we have a question coming in from Sharni Cohen on Facebook Live. If you see on Facebook friends on the side that your Facebook friends are on the side of the Erev Rav, are we obligated to respond? It's a bit of a scary social situation out there. If we don't, it's like joining them, or we need to use our discretion.
Well, I think that the last part really, sums it up. By saying using your discretion, it doesn't mean that you don't get involved. You do what you can. The first and foremost way that we fight the Erev Rav is by being a good example of Torah mitzvahs. When we live up to Torah standard, you are in fact fighting that battle. But if you're somebody who thinks that you could, and sometimes it doesn't mean that you have to fight an argument, because I found a lot of times that the arguments don't necessarily work, and not just that, but you can lose people along the way. But sometimes the argument might be worth it because of people listening in to see someone else respond. Like you said, discretion. You have to know, and I know as a product of Eisav Torah, we were taught this from the very beginning. You can talk to anybody and you can teach almost anything, but you have to always know your limitations. Never go beyond your abilities. You don't talk about proofs of something if you don't know those proofs are, in fact, you can back them up, or where the sources, the resources are, right? Discretion, I think, is the key word. If you think that you can possibly make a difference, then you should get involved, or find somebody to get involved, or find somebody to to mitigate the situation. But above all, you have to be l'shem shamayim, in other words, doing it for the right reasons, and you have to ask God for help. That's a must. We can never fight these battles on our own. I've seen it. It's amazing how God can help us out if we ask for His help, because if we're fighting His battles, He's our partner, and we can't do it alone. What were the 5 characters? You can look. Actually, you can just go online. If you look up the five categories of the Erev Rav, a paper will come up in English that actually lists them, so you can see them. But they're actually named after the Amaleki. The different. For example, one of them is building shuls and even sponsoring Sifrei Torah, but not for any Torah reason, just to have your name up on the wall, just because you want to be known as a Baal Tzedakah. That could be an Erev Rav quality. Someone who doesn't care about the poor, someone who thinks that people learning Torah should not be supported. These can be Erev Rav qualities. That's what I'm saying. It's not so uncommon. But go online or write me, and I'll send it to you. I have essays on this material too. But very simply, you can go tonight and just look up the 5 categories of Erev Rav, and it will come up in English and Zohar, and all the sources are there. That's right, Prasad.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining. If there's no more questions, we want to thank you. We want to encourage all of our viewers to go to israeltorah.org, and they can see all the videos on our project there. Also, the Miriam project, they can visit over there. There's a YouTube channel that is connected. It's at youtube.com/Israel Torah, and you can subscribe over there, and you can click the bell in order to get notified when new videos come up. You can go to Rabbi Pinchas Winston's site. I'm going to put it up again, which is 36.org. Over there also, you will be able to purchase his many books that he has written on a wide variety of subjects. Miriam, sorry, Yehudis, did you have something else to say? I'm calling you Miriam.
No, I'm fine. Just a good night, everybody, and have a wonderful Shabbos. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.